On this episode of STV, I have something a little different ahead. Stick around because this show gets going right after this. STV is brought to you by Zox Helmets, a clear view for every adventure. Ultimax Belts, performance driven, performance proven. And by Best Western Hotels and Resorts. For model year 2025, it seems as though something has changed in the snowmobile world. Now, there's definitely a lot changing outside the industry, which I don't want to touch here, but this year I see more grumblings about the costs of new sleds than I've seen in past years. You don't have to look too hard in the social media scene to come across endless comments of how new sled prices have been creeping higher and higher, and maybe they've finally hit a tipping point, or at least a nerve. Then combine these high prices with unpredictable winters with low snow accumulations, keeping people from enjoying their toys, and you get what we're seeing at the dealerships. New sled boxes are piling up as sleds go unsold. Used sleds are filling up the lots as well, making trade-in deals difficult to put together too. Then up the food chain, Yamaha is out after 2025, which we knew, but things aren't looking good around Arctic either right now with production stoppages and rumors of new ownership. Even Polaris and Skidoo are feeling the heat of a slow sales season. Better snow and interest rates may help eventually, but I think this year, more than any other year, that us consumers may finally start to rethink what we want to get out of our snowmobile purchases. Now, in the manufacturer's defense, modern sleds, especially the top-of-the-line models, are way more snowmobile than the top-of-the-line models were from 20 or 30 years ago, which I do see as one of the arguments that people are making when they're talking about price creep. Now, today's sleds have huge digital displays, electronic long travel suspensions, very complicated and more powerful engines than ever before, and high-tech chassis holding it all together, making the current sleds much more expensive to build than sleds were from the past's glory years. And they've built these sleds partially because the industry has an insatiable appetite to outdo the other guy, putting huge pressure on the manufacturers to continually provide new innovations and updates to their models year after year after year, all adding to the cost. And also because of us, because until this year it seems, all these high-end sleds, well, they've been selling. Take, for example, an old top-of-the-line Indy 650 from back in the day when, according to the internet trolls, sleds were way more affordable and selling like chiclets up against a new, modern XCR 9R. Now, these sleds are not in the same ballpark. They're not even playing the same game. There is no comparison, and the industry is never going back to those good old days of the 650. That's a pipe dream. And even if they did, Pandora's box is open. Nobody would buy a sled like that 650 anymore anyways. Another argument I see in comment sections all over the place is that the industry needs to get back to good sleds with 80 to 100 horsepower. What, are you kidding me? I mean, what color is the sky in your world? Because there's some great sleds in that 80 to 100 horsepower class right now. I mean, there's beginner sleds like the Polaris Evo or Skidoo Neo or Arctic Cat Blast and Yamaha Venom. Plus, there's been plenty of attempts by the manufacturers over the years to bring to market entry-level sleds to the buying public, like Skidoo did with the Freestyle back when, which was an ugly, bug-eyed freak. I mean, no wonder it didn't sell well. Then Yamaha tried with the last version of the Phaser, which was another sled with an acquired taste. Now, neither of these did well in the sales department, but credit has to be given to the manufacturers for even trying. I just wish they sharpened the pencil a little bit more on the MSRPs in these categories because none of those sleds, current or old, sold very well. Plus, it's also because we want and desire the big stuff. The 850s, the turbos, the digital displays with GPS, the electronic suspensions, and more overall performance than last year's sled had. And you know what? I blame us for that, the snowmobile media. Creating exciting content around the sizzle in this industry is easy. I mean, it's definitely easy to talk about the latest and greatest innovations and then take photos and videos of hyper sleds doing their thing on the trails or crazy mountain sleds carving insane lines. I mean, I love watching a performance sled take a corner in slow motion as the suspension is gripped up on the trail and the roost is flying off the back of the skis. That is sexy, but that's also 30 grand. Try that same scene on an 80 horsepower sled. Sure, you'll get some snow flying, slow motion is good for that, but it ain't the same, and these sleds are largely ignored by the media. The other thing the snowmobile media does, aside from the odd token storyline, is ignore non-current sleds. Snowmobiles that are a few years old, maybe have some miles on them and a few scuffs and bumps after 4 or 5 seasons on the snow. I mean, you know the sleds. They're the backbone of the snowmobile world and out there right now keeping this whole thing going. But the media doesn't do enough to talk to and acknowledge the riders who are out there enjoying this type of sled. Maybe the current climate out there changes not only our attitudes in the media, but also with you in the buying public when it comes to the year, make, and model of the sleds we promote and enjoy. Shining a light instead on the fun and adventure a snowmobile can bring to cold winter months, no matter what type of sled you're riding. We, the media, need to do a better job balancing out our reach to all riders of all sleds, both new and old, and of course, all performance levels. Then you out there in Snowmo land who crap on the industry need to stop pining for the good old glory days when you could buy the best sled in the market, brand new, for 10 grand. Those days are gone. Get over it. Now, we all get wrapped up in dismal sales forecasts, plant closures, and layoffs, which makes us believe the snowmobile industry is dead. Now, if this attitude doesn't change, this will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Instead, we should acknowledge that snowmobiling is a passion that you can get just as much fulfillment out of whether you're riding a one-lunger vintage machine, a 200 horsepower missile, or really anything in between. Participation is still strong out there, even though new sled sales are down, and none of us should forget that. Coming up after the break, I'm going to look back at some of the sleds we've had on STV that weren't the latest and greatest, but have given me some of the best snowmobiling memories I've had since starting this TV adventure I'm on. This segment is brought to you by Yamaha. Back on my first year hosting STV after a hiatus in the TV business, I wanted to have at least a little representation within the show about non-current sleds, and I chose a Polaris Dragon to build a number of segments around over the season. Now, we got the sled from Spoiled Sports, a dealer that was supporting us, and at the time the Dragon was 7 or 8 years old. Now, the Dragon 800 was a great sled from that era, and still is as a matter of fact, but at the time, being a few years old when we had it on the show, it needed some work, which helped generate content in that first season. Now, I rode it quite a bit too that year, as it was a great sled for the trails around home. But the main point to that sled was to show you that you didn't need a new sled to have fun and participate in snowmobiling, because even back then, I felt the snowmobile media was spending too much time just focusing on new sleds and not building content for the tens of thousands of riders who still were out there riding sleds just like that old Dragon. Back then, when those sleds were new, the Shift, which was just a stripped down Dragon, was one of my favorite sleds of that time. Still a standout when thinking back over all of the sleds that I've ridden over the decades. After the Dragon, the next non-current sled to enter my fleet was a Yamaha SRX, which again was used to generate shop content for STV because even though it was a fairly clean example of this classic Yamaha, it was a pretty high miler and it needed some work. This sled also had probably the second most iconic triple sound on the snow after the Polaris Indy 650, another sled in my collection, and that SRX was a great machine to go out for a rip around the lake on, and it basically became the young lad's machine for him to go ride around the neighborhood, back and forth to the ice rink. Ownership for this sled came full circle this past fall as we sold it at the Peterborough Sledorama. Now, I was kind of sad to see it go, and maybe one day I'll look for another, but if I do, I'm going to see if I can find one with a few less miles on it. The next sled to come into my life after the SRX was a 98 Mach Z. In fact, two Mach Zs I bought together as a pair, one in pieces and the other one not running, but all together. Now, I remember describing my score to Rich, telling him that one machine was a literal basket case and the other sled was, well, it was pretty scuzzy. And just like that, the sled had a name, the Scuzzy, also known as the sled that never fails to fail. Now, this machine came onto the scene that first season of COVID, where travel was restricted and there was all kinds of issues touring around on snowmobiles, creating a huge problem for a TV show that travels around to create content. That season, I built a lot of minutes around working on this pile, and that's because it's basically an endless mess of problems. And at the same time, quite by accident, created the first character sled on STV. Now, maybe it was the name, maybe it was the fact that so much airtime was dedicated to the sled because we couldn't do much else with the COVID restrictions, or maybe it hit just as the renewed popularity of triple sleds was building and our timing was just good. It also fit in well with my own love of classic triple sleds that began with my Indy 650, which I still have and is still up on the shelf in the shop gathering dust. Now, I've said it before that other sleds can come and go in my life, but the 650 is one I'm going to hang on to till the bitter end. The 650 was also the sled that really built my passion for sledding in my younger years when it was my daily ride. Back then, I spent way too much time and money modifying it with all the trick bits, and now it's a little bit of a hot rod time capsule, so it's pretty cool. Plus, I also think that the Polaris Wedge is one of the best looking sleds of all time with its classic muscle car looks. Now, I did fail in my goal of buying a Thundercat to complete my set of triples, and now that the SRX is gone, I'm even further away from that goal. But the Scuzzy, it's still around and being properly neglected behind the shop in the tire pile. I kind of feel bad about it sitting outside by itself, but not bad enough to throw a tarp over it evidently, but I do want to resurrect the Scuzzy one day. Now, the last time it was out was like, 2 years ago when we were out for a ride in Halliburton Forest. It made it about a mile from base camp and then it stalled out and then the recoil broke when I was trying to yank it back to life. Maybe it was the humiliation of being towed yet again back to the trailer, but I haven't touched the Scuzzy since then. One of these years I may have to change that, maybe buy a much better Mach Z and just transplant the old Scuzzy hood over to a better chassis. That would solve a lot of issues, and maybe it would pick up some top speed because the Scuzz never reached my goal of 108 miles an hour on the radar gun to match Rich's speed he set on that beautiful XER. Now, I did get close once at 106, but I don't think there's much left in that old tired chassis. Now, a funny story about the old Scuzz. There was another occasion we were on the lake having fun with the radar gun, and we were running for top speeds with a few of the newer sleds in the STV fleet. Now, it wasn't a clear ice track, it was just a beaten down path on the ice, so speeds weren't the absolute best, and I think we got close to like 90 miles an hour out of a Polaris 650 twin, and then its brother, the 850, got around 95 miles an hour, and then a brand new SRX whistled by at better than 115, but the Scuzz, well, it laid down a pass at 103, misfiring and bogging the whole time. It didn't beat the SRX, but made them new Polarises look a little silly. Pretty much all those old triple sleds are fast, and I highly recommend picking one up. Next, coming up after the break, I've got a few more sleds that have made some great snowmobiling memories for me. This segment is brought to you by Zox Helmets. The next sled up is one that's been in my family since new and was the first sled I ever remember riding as a kid, a 1980 Skidoo Citation 4500. It's now in my brother's care and is still being used. In fact, I raced it and picked up a heat win with it last season in the Beater Classic, a featured event at the Eganville Ice Oval Race. I mean, that was a time. A sled like this is worth maybe a few $100s and may not be the one you're going to go out and do a high-mile adventure with, but if you have the land to scoot around on it with, or maybe want to use it and participate in a vintage event and rides, which we've done with the Citation, it's an excellent option. There is nothing wrong with owning something like this because it can be just as fun and make memories that are just as good as a machine worth thousands of dollars more. Now, speaking of fun sleds, the next character sled on my list is Goldmember, a Yamaha Inviter. Probably the most quirky sled I've ever owned, with its relaxed riding position, yoke-style steering, and finger throttle to blast around on. I picked this sled up from a friend of mine, Ed Long, who's big into the vintage scene, and used it to build another series of segments on STV, wrapping up with a ride to and from the Eganville Ice Oval races. About a 100-mile round trip.
Oh, look at this one. Oh, that danger. Thanks. Danger's after the friggin' danger. Somebody needs to put the signs ahead of the danger so you know there's danger there. Oh! Oh, that hurt. Oh.
This ride was so much fun, and the old sled made it no problem, except for a seized up idler wheel on the suspension that it really didn't need anyway, so we just took it off. The Inviter sure won't win any beauty contests with its beige on brown color scheme or set the snow on fire with its performance, but like the Citation, it can still make some great snowmobile memories. Different memories than a new sled, but just as good anyways. And I bet with a machine like this, pulling into the snowmobile parking area at the local go-to restaurant or warm-up shack, it'll get way more attention than a lot of the other brand new sleds sitting around there, and you'll be the hero for riding it. Up next, like the SRX, the Inviter left my collection for another love, and that story is coming up right after the break. This segment is brought to you by Best Western. My next memorable sled was inspired by the ride to the Ice Oval races on Goldmember. That trip got me thinking about going racing, so in last year's series of shows, I traded in the Inviter for a Kawasaki Drifter 340 Free Air Ice Oval race sled. I wanted to prove you could go racing on the cheap, and I knew I would need a jalopy to do it, so the Drifter was perfect. It didn't take long for this sled to develop its own character either, and we came up with the name Snot-a-Rocket. Snot, because it's green, and also because we knew it was not, or snot, gonna be fast, and I felt naming this race sled after the action of blowing a booger out of your nose was somehow appropriate. Over the last season, I wanted STV to follow my journey into my first race weekend at the Ice Oval track. Now, along the way, I met some fantastic folks like the Turk, who were so generous with their time, and I also felt super welcomed into the track by everyone at the races too. And it turned out to be a perfect race weekend, even though I didn't have the best success on the oval, only finishing one race dead last over the whole event. Probably should have spent more time freshening up the 340, or maybe it would have been better to ditch it altogether and put in a more reliable and more powerful engine in the machine. But you know what? I wasn't in it to win it that weekend. I just wanted to have a good time and add another great snowmobiling experience to my list, and I absolutely did that. The Drifter and I parted ways this past fall at Sledorama as well, when I was fire sailing all my old junk. Got $400 for it, and in racing math, that means I made out like a bandit. And the fellow that bought it is going to be racing it this winter with a new engine. Hopefully he finishes more than just one race, but I have a feeling he's going to have more success than I did. Either way, I know he'll be making some great snowmobiling memories of his own along the way too, which is what I hope you take away from this show, that you don't have to spend 30 grand on the hottest, newest sled on the snow to make great snowmobiling memories of your own. Maybe your budget allows for that, and that's good for you, but maybe you've got a sled like my old lady's. That's a 2018 MXZ that's reliable enough to go anywhere you want to for 1/3 the price of new, or maybe you only have a few $100 to spend on a beater, and that's okay too. Because at the end of the day, snowmobiling is still one of the best ways to enjoy winter, and this industry, well, it ain't dead yet. Get out there any way you can, and don't forget to help out and volunteer your time with the clubs. After the last few years, they can definitely use all the help they can get. Thanks for tuning in. STV has been brought to you by Yamaha, revs your heart. The Toronto International Snowmobile, ATV, and Powersports Show, and by OSMMag.com, your digital source for everything snowmobiles.
Be sure to like and subscribe.